Tonight, after days of protest, delays, disruption,
rail service across Canada is shut down.
We're scrambling to figure out how we're going to get home tomorrow.
The impact, the demands, and Ottawa's next move.
We need to make sure that those laws are followed.
At Issue is standing by.
Get us home.
Canadians quarantined on a cruise ship demand Ottawa step in.
I'm not going to be bullied or influenced by anybody.
An extraordinary rebuke of Donald Trump from one of his most loyal allies.
And overcrowded ERs.
They come in with falls, they come in with delirium.
One hospital's plan to solve hallway medicine, and it's working. This is The National. The number of Wet'suwet'en solidarity protests may be small, but their impacts are huge.
And tonight, those protesters forced two of Canada's biggest rail lines to a halt. With just a half dozen blockades, demonstrators have pushed Via Rail to an almost complete standstill. And CN, a backbone of the Canadian economy, has shut down lines in at least half the country. The protests are in solidarity with the Wet'suwet'en hereditary chiefs, and they are opposed to a natural gas pipeline project in northern BC. Demonstrators say they won't go unless the will of the chiefs is respected. Greg Rasmussen now on the growing impact from the standoff.
In Quebec, one of a number of blockades that's managed to bring rail traffic to a screeching halt.
We are one people, so we have to stand together. We have to stand and help each other.
Another is in Saskatchewan.
We don't agree with what's happening and that we stand for the environment.
And Ontario.
When these invaders are coming to us, speaking to us about colonial rule of law, those are your laws.
With only a few exceptions, Via passenger service was canceled across the country, leaving some passengers irate.
You ever try to block a road or something, it would never be tolerated. You'll be in jail for in 24 hours.
You're wasting your time, so they're blocking.
In BC late this afternoon, commuter rail service along a CN line was canceled due to a new protest.
They want to support, then you don't block public access to transportation for thousands of people.
CN, which moves $250 billion worth of goods by rail each year, said it's shutting down its entire eastern network because the orders of the court in Ontario have yet to be enforced and continue to be ignored. Provinces hit by the disruptions are once again calling for Ottawa to clarify its consultation process with Indigenous groups.
These things can be spelled out, and they can be spelled out and need to be spelled out because we are not getting anywhere as a country.
Amid the escalating tension, some progress. This blockade ended today after BC's government agreed to new talks with the Gitxsan and Wet'suwet'en First Nations.
But now, with Canada shut down, the pressure's on. It's an opportunity for the governments, provincial and Canada, to correct this.
With barricades gone in some areas, going up in others, there was this close encounter between a train and pipeline opponents in BC early this evening, showing it's very much a fluid, uncertain situation for all. Greg Rasmussen, CBC News, Vancouver.
Now, Prime Minister Trudeau had tried as much as possible to stay out of this, urging both Wet'suwet'en leaders and the BC government to find a solution on their own. But as Olivia Stefanovich explains, today his hand was forced.
After days of political pressure over blockades like this one, today the Prime Minister responded.
Obviously, we're a country of the rule of law, and we need to make sure that those laws are followed.
A significant shift in tone. The federal government had described this as an issue between British Columbia and the Wet'suwet'en. Now, as the Canadian economy braces for damage, the Liberals changed their strategy. This morning, a letter from the Minister of Indigenous Services to the Mohawk, inviting them to a meeting with one request: discontinue the protest and barricades at the train tracks, and encouraging them to end the protest here in Tyendinaga, Ontario, in support of the Wet'suwet'en. The Prime Minister may be overseas, but he has been getting briefed regularly on the situation. And so today, he wrote to the hereditary chiefs offering to have Crown Indigenous Relations Minister Carolyn Bennett attend the meeting between the Wet'suwet'en and the BC Premier to discuss the current situation and to seek a process that avoids such situations in the future.
I had a long and constructive conversation with Premier Horgan on the flight.
And while barricades in some parts of the country come down, others, like this one in Ontario, remain, with some protesters not yet ready to give up. Olivia Stefanovic, CBC News, Tyne-Denega.
Clearly, there are differences between the Wet'suwet'en hereditary chiefs and the government over the pipeline project. Less clear is how much support the chiefs have among their own people. Tina Lovegreen now on the internal divisions within that Indigenous community.
I see on social media where our people get targeted.
Ever since the pipeline was approved, Karen Ogun-Taves says she's been facing resistance, even threats. As a former elected Wet'suwet'en chief, she signed one of the agreements to approve the Coastal GasLink pipeline.
In my heart, I know I'm doing the right thing. I've done the right thing for our people, and my heart is in the right place.
And as the CEO of the First Nations LNG Alliance, she believes the project will bring prosperity.
If our people are living in poverty, the way to overcome it is through proper training, trades, education, and a job.
20 First Nations, including 5 out of 6 elected band councils of the Wet'suwet'en, have signed on to the project, but the hereditary chiefs, the traditional leaders in place before the imposition of the Indian Act, oppose it.
The hereditary leadership and everything that represents has been ignored and bypassed, and that's unacceptable.
They have never given up their right to self-determination.
This expert says the government has never officially acknowledged the traditional governance of the hereditary chiefs, but each community is dealing with that differently.
People expect Indigenous people to be united, or if they're not, then that's some sort of criticism, like you obviously don't have your house in order. But nobody is united on one particular thing.
In Kitimat, a $40 billion LNG export facility is being built in the riding of BC Liberal MLA Ellis Ross, previously an elected chief councillor for the Haisla Nation and longtime advocate for LNG. He says politicians should stay out of the discussions inside the Wet'suwet'en First Nation.
You've got to leave these communities alone to let them decide their own leadership questions on their own without interference and no manipulation.
Several clan meetings are planned.
Stop the divide. Like the elected councils are Wet'suwet'en people. They're clan members too, and we all matter.
Which gives Ogun-Taves hope they can find a path forward. Tina Lovegreen, CBC News, Chilliwack.
And we'll have more on this story later in the hour. Rosie and At Issue are standing by to talk about the government's response and what could happen next.
Canadians quarantined for days now on a cruise ship off the coast of Japan are getting desperate. More than 200 passengers are sick with the coronavirus, among them 12 Canadians. Here's Kelly Crow with one couple's pleas for help.
It has become the cruise from hell, with more than 250 Canadians trapped in their cabins.
A floating jailhouse.
That's Alan Chow and his wife Diana from Toronto. They haven't left their room in 7 days, and they desperately want off the ship. They even joined Twitter to call for help, tweeting photos of their meals, their room. And they're also working the phones, calling Ottawa and the local embassy in Japan.
The answer is same thing.
They're working on it.
Yeah, they're working on it.
The Ministry of Health has just advised us of an additional 44 positive tests from prior tests.
The passengers on this ship are now part of a living science experiment, a floating petri dish.
We've known for a long time that cruise ships are perfectly designed to spread viral infections.
Also limit close contact by maintaining a 6 feet or 2 meter distance away from others.
The narrow quarters on board make it hard to follow even that instruction. And already, at least 218 passengers have somehow become infected, the largest concentration of cases outside China. So far, 12 Canadians are sick, including the couple traveling with the Chows.
What I am afraid right now is only 7 days, 218 affected, including my friend. And some of them are serious, like my friend.
Today, Canada's Foreign Affairs Minister had some promising news.
We understand that from the Japanese authorities that they may allow for some people to disembark from the ship and be put in quarantine on shore. We are following with that.
The details of that plan have so far not been released.
Get us home.
It can't happen soon enough for the Chows. Kelly Crow, CBC News, Toronto.
Now, another cruise ship carrying hundreds more Canadians has finally anchored off the coast of Cambodia. This after being turned away by several other countries over coronavirus fears. The MS Westerdam was told a week ago that Japan would not accept it. There were concerns it might have come into contact with infected people, but there are no confirmed cases on board. Since last week, it's been searching for a place to let people off. Canada's Foreign Affairs Minister says his Cambodian counterpart assures him passengers are being helped.
At the disembarkation of the Canadians on board, we have more than 250 Canadians on board, that they could go on shore, be transferred to Phnom Penh, which is the capital, and then onward to their destination.
It'll take a few days for the more than 1,400 passengers to be flown to the capital and then home. Now in China, there is political fallout from this outbreak. 2 top officials fired. And as Sasha Petrusik shows us, blame could shift to the president next.
Some 2 months since the coronavirus was first found in Wuhan and hushed up, senior Communist Party officials are paying the price. The top man in virus-filled Hubei province was fired today, as was the party boss for Wuhan. Both were dismissed by President Xi Jinping. It was Xi's first real strike against local officials who have angered people at the epicenter of this crisis. After disappearing for days as the epidemic grew bigger and as doctors and patients grew desperate, Xi only resurfaced this week in Beijing, joking with locals, touring a hospital, and urging on Wuhan medical workers by video link. Xi has avoided actually visiting the hardest hit area, even as the government response initially floundered.
Prove to the world that this kind of party-state system is quite fragile.
Commentators like Bruce Lui say after building up his power for 7 years, Xi is trying to duck responsibility.
In good time, he can get all the applause. But during the bad time, when people want to find someone to blame, he is the one to blame.
And an even bigger crisis could be looming for Xi, an economic one, if quarantined workers can't get back to their factories soon.
The supply chain will create some kind of pressure. Not only Chinese companies, but also like Asia companies and also like in the US.
As the problems pile up, Xi is facing the biggest challenge since he became president. His power and stature have grown so much, he's reverently called the people's leader. Trouble is, right now, the people aren't happy. Sasha Petrusik, CBC News, Hong Kong.
Washington and Chinese technology giant Huawei are locked in legal warfare. Canada has been caught in the middle, and now that war is heating up. The U.S. Justice Department filed a raft of brand new charges on top of those related to Canada's arrest of top executive Meng Wanzhou. The new charges paint the company as a criminal enterprise that spent decades stealing secrets from U.S. companies. As Katie Simpson explains, this will have an impact on the U.S.-China relationship with implications for Canada.
Upping the ante against Huawei, the U.S. Department of Justice added fresh charges to its case against the Chinese technology giant, accusing it of racketeering, stealing trade secrets, and violating sanctions by doing business in North Korea. Allegations that come as Canada is still deciding whether to allow the Chinese firm to help build its 5G network.
We're still doing our due diligence. We're examining all the relevant facts. We're engaging with our allies.
The Trump administration is demanding Canada and other allies ban Huawei from anything related to 5G, next-generation networks that will boost internet speeds. The U.S. fears Huawei will spy for the Chinese government. Last month, the UK defied the American demand, allowing Huawei to take on a limited role.
The United Kingdom has made a decision recently about Huawei and their 5G deployment. We're examining those options.
This is part of a much larger battle between Washington and Beijing to be the world's leader in technology.
Little space.
Canada is stuck in the middle after police in Vancouver arrested Huawei CFO Meng Wanzhou on an extradition request from the U.S. China has retaliated by detaining 2 Canadian citizens, by blocking billions of dollars in canola sales, and by threatening to make things worse if Huawei is banned.
There isn't really a great outcome here. Either we're going to end up upsetting the United States or we're going to end up upsetting China.
One Canadian telecom isn't waiting for Ottawa's decision. In a statement, TELUS announced today it will begin rolling out its 5G network shortly, and our initial module will be with Huawei.
I believe this is a way that TELUS is trying to apply pressure to the government.
Ottawa should brace for blowback if it does not ban Huawei. President Donald Trump reportedly launched into a scathing tirade against Prime Minister Boris Johnson when they spoke about the UK's decision. Katie Simpson, CBC News, Washington.
There is a lingering question tonight in Washington. Has American justice been subverted to serve Donald Trump? Now, Trump raged against the prison sentence faced by his longtime ally, and that sentence was mysteriously lightened. Now, as Paul Hunter explains, the U.S. Attorney General is on air, trying to reassure critics this isn't what it looks like.
Seemingly in lockstep with the president from the get-go, U.S. Attorney General Bill Barr has long been derisively labeled by critics little more than Donald Trump's very own personal lawyer. Today, from Barr, a slapdown against Trump.
I have a problem with some of the tweets.
Some of Trump's tweets, he said,
make it impossible for me to do my job, and I'm not going to be bullied or influenced by anybody. And I said at the time, whether it's Congress, newspaper, editorial boards, or the president, I'm going to do what I think is right.
Roger Stone did nothing wrong.
The stunning rebuke from Barr is all about longtime Trump ally Roger Stone, who's convicted of obstructing investigators examining the 2016 Trump campaign's links with Russia. On Monday, federal lawyers recommended he now spend 7 to 9 years in prison. In a tweet hours later, Trump called that horrible and very unfair. And soon after that, the Justice Department changed its sentencing recommendation, softening it. Not because of Trump, said Barr, but nonetheless, 4 of Barr's prosecutors then withdrew from the case in protest. Trump congratulated Barr.
A 9-year sentence for doing nothing. You have murderers and drug addicts. They don't get 9 years. 9 years for doing something that nobody even can define what he did.
And even as Barr pushed back against Trump, so too Trump's former chief of staff, John Kelly, who last night likewise lashed out at the president, saying, among other swipes, that in those nuclear talks with North Korea, Trump got played. Tweeted Trump today, Kelly was in over his head.
And indeed, Bill Barr was reminded Trump has no patience for disloyalty. He was asked, is he prepared for what Trump may do to him now? Said the Attorney General, of course. Paul Hunter, CBC News, Washington.
John Baird made it official tonight he won't be entering the Conservative leadership race. Baird, who stepped down 5 years ago as Stephen Harper's Foreign Affairs Minister, has been sought after to challenge presumed frontrunner Peter MacKay. But in a series of early evening tweets, Baird thanked Canadians for their support and confirmed he would not be running, adding he was incredibly happy with his post-political life and that he will remain a proud Conservative activist. Closing arguments are underway at the trial of former movie mogul Harvey Weinstein.
The defense is trying to present Harvey Weinstein as the real victim.
The defense rests. Next on The National, we take you inside the courtroom.
Crowding, waits, so-called hallway medicine. We look at a Toronto hospital solution.
We got a notice that the train was canceled.
And it's At Issue Night, the politics of the protest. Rosie and the gang on what comes next. We're back in 2. Welcome back. The trial of former Hollywood mogul Harvey Weinstein is in closing arguments, and today his defense blasted his accusers and the accusations as a Me Too fever dream not supported by the facts. Stephen D'Souza has Weinstein's last word in court before the jury deliberates.
You talk to us after today, Harvey.
The lawyers will.
A former movie mogul known for attending red carpet premieres, today Harvey Weinstein took a front row seat at the most critical production of his life.
Donna, are you ready today?
I'm ready.
His lead attorney took the starring role, describing the prosecution's case as an alternate universe. They've created a universe that strips the adult women of common sense, autonomy, and responsibility, Donna Rotuno told the jury. The defense has always contended that Weinstein's encounters with the women who testified against him were consensual. Today, Rotuno zeroed in on the two main accusers, Mimi Haley and Jessica Mann. She questioned their motives and their changing and inconsistent stories. Rotuno highlighted Jessica Mann's admission that she had a sexual relationship with Weinstein, even after he allegedly raped her in a New York hotel room in 2013. She made a choice that she wanted the life that he could potentially provide for her. Highlighting years of friendly, even flirty messages between the two, Rotuno asked if Mann's behavior was that of someone who was raped or someone in a relationship. She reminded the jury this isn't a popularity contest. Being a sex addict and being a rapist are two different things.
The defense is trying to present Harvey Weinstein as the real victim. I don't think that Harvey Weinstein is deserving of certainly my sympathy.
Gloria Allred represents two of the women in this case. She said the defense was relying on outdated rape myths and that there are numerous reasons why victims maintain contact, even sexually, with their assailant.
It doesn't mean that the original rape or sexual assault didn't happen if there's subsequent contact.
Rotuno told jurors that they are all that stands between Weinstein and an overzealous prosecution fueled by the media.
So, Stephen, this trial continues to be portrayed as the Me Too movement versus the mogul. Did Weinstein's defense tackle that?
Yeah, they said that Weinstein was the target of the movement and that the women changed their stories after the New York Times expose came out in 2017. And for that reason, they said jurors should look at what the women said at the time of the events, not what they're saying now.
And how did Weinstein respond to everything today?
Well, as Weinstein was leaving, he said he loved Rotuno's comments. Then he referenced a movie that he made saying, "I made the King's speech, that was the Queen's speech." Adrian asked the prosecution they'll give their closing arguments tomorrow, and then deliberations are expected to begin on Tuesday.
All right, thank you. Stephen D'Souza in New York tonight.
And we are following several other stories across the country tonight, starting in Regina, where police say a 25-year-old is responsible for 3 separate killings over 3 months. Dylan Ricky Whitehawk has been charged with first-degree murder in connection with 3 killings starting in November of last year. Police say Whitehawk is a member of a Saskatchewan-based street gang, but don't believe the killings were gang-directed. The commute was a big pain in Toronto this morning after a derailment shut down a section of the city's subway for more than 6 hours.
I'm always late because of TTC.
It's just a big sinking feeling in my stomach, not again, this again.
Yeah, this is the second such incident in less than a month. More than 100 shuttle buses were brought in, but at this point, officials have not determined what caused this derailment in the first place. And author, magazine writer, and columnist Anne Kingston has died. The Toronto native held a long tenure as a senior writer at Maclean's magazine, covering high-profile stories like the Bill Cosby trial and the murders of Honey and Barry Sherman. Kingston was diagnosed in December with an aggressive cancer. She was 62.
Still ahead on the National, if you've been to an emergency room, you've probably seen it. Patients enduring long waits, sometimes in hallways. Well, ahead, one Toronto hospital's plan to end those waits and why it's working. But first, let's get you over to Rosie in Ottawa.
Hey, Adrian, it's At Issue Night, Thursday, my favorite day of the week. Chantel, Andrew, Althea Raj tackle the politics of the protest. As the tension between protesters and provincial governments ratchets up, what will it take to get the two sides across the table? At Issue is back right after this. After more than a week of anti-pipeline protests spreading now on rail tracks across the country, Via Rail has temporarily canceled most of its services and CN has shut down its eastern operations.
Obviously, we're a country of the rule of law, and we need to make sure that those laws are followed.
But earlier today, the federal government also changed the way it was engaging. The Minister of Indigenous Services has now offered to meet with the Tyendinaga Mohawk protesters in return for ending that blockade. And in BC, a similar offer from the Premier and Ottawa to the Wet'suwet'en hereditary chiefs. So what do we make of how the federal government has handled all of this? It is Thursday, and I'm here with that issue. Chantal Hébert is in Montreal, Andrew Coyne is in Toronto, and Althea Raj is here in Ottawa tonight. Good to see you all. Okay, what changed here, do we think, or was this now the only thing that could have happened, Chantal?
Well, I'm sure the government must have had some advance notice of what was coming. I mean, there had been plenty of advance warnings from the rail companies that they were looking at closure or stopping their operations because these demonstrations were not coming to a halt. I'm guessing that from the outside, most Canadians would not be able to answer your question as to how the federal government has handled this, because the impression is that they have not handled it.
Well, is it the impression that they have not handled it, Andrew, or is it the impression that they have tried to keep it as a British Columbia Wet'suwet'en issue and now have been dragged into it?
I think those are two ways of saying the same thing. It's been a noticeable absence of leadership, in part because the Prime Minister has been overseas, in part because they don't seem to have been fully seized with this issue. It's been building over the last week from essentially a difference of political differences within the Wet'suwet'en community that has been allowed to spiral out of control. And the sight of various ministers bleating that this is a provincial matter, that don't ask us to deal with it just because it involves, for example, railways, I just think has been a pretty disgraceful absence of leadership.
Althea, do you agree with that, or do you think that there was any benefit to seeing if it could work out a different way without the federal government doing now what they're going to do over the next few days?
I agree that there was a vacuum of leadership. I think in part it was because the Prime Minister was overseas, but that I think raises other questions, like can't ministers take actions independently? I mean, surely the phone exists, right? We send PCO to follow the Prime Minister around and have a secure site wherever he goes for particular reasons. It took too long for the federal government to get involved, and I think the level of involvement was basically, I'm writing 3 emails to a group of Mohawks in Ontario, and we will respond to a letter from an Indigenous community that's tangentially related to this issue, saying Minister Bennett will sit down in British Columbia.
Chantal? Yep.
Oh, there are 2 things here. If it takes a rail blockade to bring the Prime Minister or his government to a conversation, that's bad from the perspective of Indigenous Canadians. But if a blockade of trains is liable to bring the government to a conversation, it's also bad.
Yep.
Because it rewards what is ultimately illegal behavior.
Yeah, I guess the hereditary chiefs that have been protesting are different, and we've all sort of read about this over the course of the week, than the elected band in Wet'suwet'en. And I wonder, again, to put it on the table, whether talking to the hereditary chiefs, which was the initial request, would have not led credence to a group of people that the majority of the community doesn't necessarily agree with. Would there have been any danger in doing that?
But did not the government of British Columbia, as far as I understand, spend some time until recently trying to come to agreement with those same chiefs? So it's not as if no one has been talking to them.
Yeah, no, and the company itself tried to reach out to them, and they didn't want to talk either. Andrew?
You not only have a difference between the elected councils and chiefs and the hereditary chiefs, you have differences within the hereditary chiefs. There were 3 hereditary chiefs who were in favor of the pipeline who were mysteriously stripped of their title.
Yes.
So there are basic differences and breakdowns of the governance structures there, obviously with very deep roots, and we can go into all of that. But clearly, when it's become this kind of tinderbox, you got to go to the root of that and try to work out some better decision-making structure so that this sort of thing doesn't happen again.
What does it tell us about sort of reconciliation writ large? And I don't mean, like it's dead or whatever some of the protesters have been saying. I mean in terms of how difficult it is or isn't, and the opportunities that are there that may or may not be taken by governments. I'll start with you, Althea, on that.
Well, I don't think reconciliation is dead. I think what this issue highlights is that issues that are not dealt with will continue to come to the fore, whether it's that they go asleep for a week or 2, or they go asleep for a few months, or they go asleep for a few years. They will keep popping back up on the radar. And I think the fact that You know, if you talk to hereditary chiefs and lawyers in the groups that support them, or you talk to the federal government today, you got two very, very different interpretation of who they should be listening to and what the actual rights are. So obviously the issue of asserting title and what the territory is exactly and what the rights of the hereditary chiefs are and who speaks for whom, that has not been adequately dealt with.
No. Chantal, on that point too.
Well, no community in this country speaks with one voice. That doesn't exist, so that isn't really different from what happens in indigenous communities. But the real question is not whether one should listen to the band council or hereditary chief, but whether one should listen to the will of the community, and it's far from clear for me at this point who really speaks for the will of the community, for the government of British Columbia. And few governments would have done more due diligence on an issue like that than that particular government, by the way. The sense is that the community is speaking through the band council, and that referendums have taken place. I am guessing that the usual rules apply to everyone. That is, the voice of the community has to be heard, no matter the title of the people who don't like the end result.
Mm-hmm. Last point on this, and then one quick round on John Baird. Andrew?
Well, there is a crying need for more clarity on who speaks for Indigenous peoples on these issues, not just in this present case, but more generally. There's a crying need for clarity on what exactly the duty to consult obtains, whether it's just simply whether a right to prerogative of consent or something more illusory than that. And there's an issue of what exactly reconciliation means. And the impression you get from some of these issues is it's a moving target that recedes the further you get, the closer you get to it. And unless we start to clarify these things, I think we're going to continue to be stumbling around in the dark.
Quickly now on the news that John Baird is also out of the Conservative leadership race, which is really the only story of the race at this point, who doesn't want the job. Just quickly, all of you on what you make of that, Chantal.
Well, it's, again, not as exciting as it could have been. This is, at this point, looking at the field, something will have to break, or else it's called policy discussion, or else it's going to be one long, painful process to the least bad alternative being elected.
Yeesh. Andrew?
It is turning into something of a fiasco, and particularly for what, if I can borrow a phrase, I might call the conservative wing of the Conservative Party, who do not have a candidate in this race and are enormously frustrated by it. I think that's in part due to the ridiculously restrictive rules that were set up, that were supposed to get the star candidates in and the SOCONs out, and they haven't succeeded on either front. But I think it's also a legacy of Stephen Harper and the failure to recruit and advance stronger candidates who could step up into this race is a real, as I said before, a really thin bench.
What do you think, Althea?
I don't think it's Stephen Harper's fault. I think there's a lot of people in the Stephen Harper cabinet who, unfortunately, for a number of personal reasons or the fact that they died, are not in this race. I don't think it has anything to do with Stephen Harper not having a strong cabinet.
There were way too many people in that cabinet who were there not because of their talents or their ideas, but because they were slavishly loyal to the leader. And everybody in the party knows it.
That is not fair. There were some strong cabinet ministers. John Barrett and Ron Ambrose certainly among them. James Moore. There were lots of people.
We're not through the fingers in one hand yet.
Okay. Anyways, to the point. I agree this is maybe not as interesting a contest as we had hoped. Aaron O'Toole is obviously going to try to cast himself as that movement conservative voice that can carry on the Stephen Harper tradition. Whether he's successful or not, we will see. But it seems like everybody who's decided not to contest is incredibly happy with their decision. Pierre Poilievre was in the CBC studio just earlier today and seemed as happy as I remember ever seeing him. So
I also wonder if there's a calculation of risk, though, and I'll end on this with you, Chantal, that it's okay to take a job if you know you're going to win and then you know you're going to be prime minister. If the risk is too high to meet those bars, it's not really as tantalizing, is it?
I think there's as good a chance of becoming prime minister if you're a strong candidate in this race as there ever was. The political cycle is much further in the case of Justin Trudeau than it was the last time the Conservatives picked a leader. There is no reason to believe that the next Conservative leader would not have a strong shot at becoming Prime Minister in 24 months.
That makes it even stranger then, doesn't it? If it's a legitimate shot, why wouldn't you want to try it?
It's really hard in the contest period that you have to be able to come in as an outsider and win. Basically, you have until February 27th to decide, until April 17th to sell members.
Yeah.
And
except John Baird was far from an outsider.
And raise $500,000.
Right. Okay. I'm going to leave it there. We'll see who else doesn't run. No, I guess it ends next week, so we'll see what the race really is next week. Thank you all. Before we go, be sure to subscribe to At Issue, the podcast, for extra content. This week, we're going to talk a little bit about Canada's pitch for a seat on the UN Security Council. Look for it on any major podcast app, our website, cbcnews.ca/thenational. Now it's back to Adrian and Andrew in Toronto.
All right, thanks, Rosie. Next on The National, Bombardier gets out of the commercial aviation game. What it means for Quebec's big investment in the company and hundreds of jobs.
Plus, this turkey was a menace for an Ontario town until she stole their hearts. The story of Van Turken ahead.
Canada's once mighty Bombardier has fallen on hard times. It has sold off its commercial jetliner division that billions of tax dollars helped develop. As Alison Northcott tells us, Bombardier is now trying to dig its way out of debt.
For months, Bombardier workers have faced uncertainty around the company's future and their jobs. We'll continue to do our work, he says, with a little bit of relief. With soaring debt and facing losses this year, Bombardier sold off its part of the A220 passenger jet program to Airbus.
We want to exit commercial aviation and to concentrate on business jet, because this is a place where we believe that there's a bigger potential.
In 2016, the previous Quebec government invested more than $1 billion in the A220 program, formerly called the C-Series.
The nervous center of the A220, the knowledge is not in Toulouse, not in Hamburg, it's here.
Today, Quebec's economy minister was optimistic the province will one day see a return on that investment and confident more than 3,000 jobs will be protected. But opposition parties are skeptical.
Bombardier is falling apart. We have insecurity about jobs.
Every time that Bombardier had a financial problem, they came to the government of Quebec asking for more money, and there was no guarantee of success about that.
Bombardier has been an anchor of Quebec's aerospace industry and has benefited from millions of taxpayer dollars, but the province says it has no plans to give it any more.
It's a sad day, frankly.
Analysts say Bombardier took on too much at once.
3 programs all in one go for such a small player without the deep pockets that, the Boeing and Airbus of this world have was a big, big gamble.
There could be more changes ahead for Bombardier. The company has reportedly been in talks to sell off its rail division, too. Alison Northcott, CBC News, Montreal.
Okay, still ahead on The National. That magic moment an astronaut who's been in space for a year reunites with her dog. You're not going to want to miss it. Plus,
make sure that they're going home safely in the evening instead of staying overnight.
hospitals across the country are struggling with more patients than beds. Next, how one Toronto hospital is figuring out who's better off being treated at home.
I'm Jamie Poisson, and tomorrow on CBC's daily news podcast Front Burner, as protests over the Coastal GasLink pipeline continue, we explain why there's so much disagreement over who has authority over Wet'suwet'en territory. Subscribe wherever you get your podcasts.
Hallway medicine is now a familiar Canadian story, as emergency rooms overflow with patients and doctors and nurses struggle to keep up. And with an aging population, it's set to get worse. But Mike Crawley takes us inside one Ontario hospital that may actually be reversing the tide. It's Secret, a team that specializes in keeping patients at home.
Nearly 200 patients pass through this emergency room at Toronto's Sunnybrook Hospital on a typical day. And staff noticed a problem.
Patients that come in, they need to be medically worked up, but they don't necessarily need to stay in this acute level of care for any long period of time.
Particularly with frail elderly patients, ER doctors are sometimes reluctant to send them home.
There are patients who maybe we felt because of their risk of falls, they need to stay in hospital.
And then, Sean, if I can engage you.
Sunnybrook's solution? Creating this team that looks beyond the hospital to ensure those ER patients can be safe at home.
Apparently his wife heard a bang this morning, found her husband on the bathroom floor.
A geriatric nurse, a social worker, a physiotherapist, staff from home care agencies, all part of what Sunnybrook calls its ED1 team. Every morning they walk through their target group of emergency room patients.
So they come in with different syndromes, they come in with falls, they come in with delirium, depression.
The team runs 7 days a week, setting up home care and other health supports straight from the ER.
We've been able to get patients mobilized, connect them to community resources, and make sure that they're going home safely in the evening instead of staying overnight or being admitted to hospital.
It's part of an effort to reduce the demands on Sunnybrook, struggling, like many Ontario hospitals, with more patients than beds. Sunnybrook's team launched in October and is already showing signs of success, a nearly 5% drop in admissions among patients aged 70 and older.
We really are able to reduce the number of patients who are in hallways in our emergency department, as well as the number of patients who are stuck in the waiting room.
It makes this busy ER a little less busy and makes patients happier not to spend the night in hospital. Mike Crawley, CBC News, Toronto.
We're following several other stories tonight, including the matter of an Uber driver in the U.S. charged with kidnapping after taking a couple on a harrowing ride.
The driver won't let us out.
The couple says the Uber was rear-ended and its driver then chased the person who hit him. The passengers live-streamed everything on Facebook. The Uber driver eventually stopped. He has now been arrested, is facing numerous charges, including abduction and reckless driving. The passengers suffered some minor injuries.
I'm really sorry about the choices that were made.
So we're now hearing from players on the Houston Astros for the first time since the team's sign-stealing scandal rocked Major League Baseball. A report released last month found the team cheated during the 2017 season when they won the World Series. Astros owner Jim Crane fired the team's manager and general manager over the scandal, but none of the players were punished for cheating. An American astronaut who spent almost a year in space got the warmest welcome home. That is Christina Cook reuniting with her dog LBD, that is short for Little Brown Dog. Cook posted the video on Twitter saying, "Not sure who was more excited, glad she remembers me after a year." Cook was in space for 328 days. That is the longest space flight ever for a woman. She was also part of the first all-female spacewalk.
See that tail going back and forth. Next on The National, how a turkey went from terrorizing an Ontario town to basically becoming its unofficial mascot.
There's lots of stuff. There's merch, there's t-shirts and mugs and coffee sleeves. I think there might even be a coffee named after her now.
But now this turkey's ready to move on. Its moment in the spotlight is our moment. Next.
Well, they're not the prettiest of creatures, and frankly, they can get kind of mean. But this wild turkey in particular, named Van Turken, has managed to win over an entire town in eastern Ontario. So Van Turken is a bit of a prickly personality, a troublemaker in town, but instead of making people angry, the ornery, aggressive personality has created a legion of fans in Kemptville, and that is our moment tonight.
I first saw her, I think it was October or November last year, and my daughter happens to live on a back street in Kemptville called Van Buren.
So that's how she earned her name. How she got her notoriety, well, that's a longer tale.
I would often have to stop my car because she would be in the road. She decided to move to our main thoroughway.
Basically, she was a traffic hazard who went where she wanted, when she wanted, and was not into making friends. Still, it seems people sort of fell in love. Lisa Brownrigg created a Facebook group, now followed by more than 2,000 people, and there's merchandise.
There's t-shirts and mugs and coffee sleeves. I think there might even be a coffee named after her now.
But this love story might just be over. Van Turken was picked up by police not to be a jailbird, but to be released, where she can allegedly wreak a little less havoc. But she's not going to be forgotten. It seems the good people of Kemptville plan on having like a Van Turken trot to raise money for a wildlife rehab. And I had to read this twice. It seems they're not sure if they're ever going to eat turkey again. It's too sensitive.
Well, except, okay, so there's also, I guess they had a sort of like a Facebook poll to decide what to name the turkey, and so Van Turken obviously came out on top. The number 2 name, Miss Waddlebutts, nice. Which is not bad. But the 3rd place name, Dinner. No word of a lie. That's the National for this February 13th. Have a good night.
Good night.